What are the drivers of societal disintegration? Complexity scientist and quantitative historian Peter Turchin believes he has found the answer with his powerful model known as elite overproduction. When opportunities and resources become scarce, conditions of elite overproduction may arise as people strive for social mobility. For several decades, universities have been minting more and more graduates. These graduates aspire for a better life and to improve, or at least maintain, their socioeconomic standing. If society produces too many graduates, too many elite aspirants, but it doesn't have enough free spots or opportunities to absorb them, society becomes unstable and prone to disintegration. In the modern West, and America in particular, we are already rapidly approaching a crisis point. Go to university, take on massive debt, and guarantee yourself a better life, they said. But past performance is no guarantee of future results. In this video, we'll explore Turchin's model of elite overproduction and also place it into the modern context. What Western leaders and policymakers have built for us over the past 20 or 30 years is a perfect storm. One can debate whether this is merely a passive, emergent phenomenon of a complex society undergoing entropic decay, or whether it was done with a degree of intentionality. What are all the buttons, switches, and dials that one would need to turn to accelerate the process of societal destabilization? If they were all set to 10, perhaps, our suspicions would be warranted. What do anti-Western ideologies, deindustrialization, open borders, neo-Marxist identity essentialism, and the overproduction of university graduates have in common? They all synergistically maximize the probability of societal destabilization, chaos, and collapse. To those with vast wealth and resources, nothing is more profitable than a good crisis, and one must never let a good crisis go to waste. But of course, they would never seek to engineer a crisis, now would they? Because, as we're led to believe, the masters are always benevolent and conspiracy theories don't exist. But we will investigate it in parallel as a thought experiment nonetheless. In his work as a complexity scientist and quantitative historian, Turchin lays out four main drivers of social instability. Let's see if we can determine how many of them are operative today. First, we have the base layer, what Turchin describes as popular immiseration, or in simpler terms, the regular people becoming poorer, increased scarcity, and a contraction of available resources and opportunities. This is related to the concept of the wealth pump. The distribution of wealth within society tends to fluctuate over time, but due to structural advantages, the elite and upper classes of society will always tend to concentrate wealth and resources. For much of human history, for example, the top 1% would control the majority of a nation's wealth. In other words, massive wealth inequality is the historical norm, and the presence of a robust, prosperous middle class, something the West has enjoyed since the end of World War II, is an outright historical anomaly. As the pendulum always swings, a reversion to the mean, don't be so naive to disbelieve that one day you won't find yourself back in the conditions that we only associate with the past. In the historical context, population size plays a strong role in popular immiseration and wealth inequality. For example, if we assume a historical wealth distribution where the top 1% held 50 to 60% of a nation's wealth, with the remaining 10% holding 20 to 30% of the nation's wealth, we would only have 10 to 20% left over for the underclass, the bottom 90% of the population. After periods of great crisis, epidemics, famine, or war, the size of the underclass could reduce by 10, 30, or even 60%. This would result in a golden age of the laborer, where they would enjoy better wages and less competition for scarce resources. A successful war came with another factor that led to better conditions for the underclass. Thousands of trained killers, soldiers returning home, already trained by the system in military discipline and strategy, as well as violence. The ruling classes would watch them with a careful eye and attempt to appease their dogs of war, lest they turn on their masters, or at the very least, quickly drum up a new conflict, or find some overseas territories in which to redeploy them. During this phase, the elite classes, of course, would maintain their hold over 80 to 90% of the wealth, but since the slice of the pie would be shared amongst a smaller underclass population, it provided them with better living conditions. In other words, win-win for everyone. Over time, the population of the underclass would recover, resources would become more scarce, wages would drop, and popular immiseration would once again reach a peak. In order to avoid peasant revolts and military rebellions, historically, the ruling elites would often use this as an opportunity to foment chaos or war. Better to enlist the peasants against a foreign enemy than risk them breaching the castle walls looking for heads to take. Or, if you were in command of a sizable military force, fomenting a peasant uprising against a less well-retinued rival could pay dividends. Today, we can hear echoes of this very thing as the ultra-wealthy seemingly rush to construct bunkers and even acquire private security forces, not to mention the limousine liberal classes who seek shelter behind the walls of gated communities, in between advocating for endless open borders, the decriminalization of crime itself, and defunding police forces, but not the police forces that guard them, of course. If we look at modern America, we can see that things have actually improved substantially for us peasants. However, this trend is definitely reversing. In other words, America and much of the West is facing a new wave of popular immiseration. The wealth pump, pumping wealth into the elite stratosphere at a rapid pace, thanks to the elite enriching policies of outsourcing, deindustrialization, and economic financialization. This graph is very interesting because we can see the wealth flux. We can see that the top 1%, the purple line, has been slowly accumulating a greater share of wealth since the 1990s. The gray line represents the next 9% of the top end of the wealth distribution. For simplicity, we'll just refer to them as the top 10%. Although more precisely, they are the top 1.5 to 10% of the wealth distribution and do not include the top 1%. The gray line has remained remarkably consistent. Broadly, this class of people is a mix of property and equity-owning boomers, as well as a group of people that can be broadly referred to as the modern managerial class, the government bureaucrats and corporate manager handmaidens who have overseen and facilitated outsourcing, deindustrialization, and popular immiseration. If they work hard or sociopathically enough, they could even elevate themselves into the top 1%. The red line is the bottom 90%, the middle class and the underclass. Here, we can see a very interesting and telling pattern. The red line and purple line move with complementarity, as if in reverse sync, with the wealth of the bottom 90 slowly being sucked out and transferred to the purple line of the top 1%. This is the wealth pump in action. Another metric that demonstrates the wealth pump is income relative to GDP per capita. Here, we divide the median personal income by the GDP per capita. If this metric declines, it implies that the GDP of a nation is growing, but the median income is not. In other words, the wealthy are getting wealthier, but not sharing the spoils with the rest of us. Coming out of the 1970s, the decade that laid the groundwork for the decay and decline of the American middle class, we can see this metric drop rapidly. It also drops at an accelerated rate after 2001, when China entered the World Trade Organization, and outsourcing and deindustrialization became all the rage. And again, we see a strong drop, worse than the 2000s, but slightly less than the 1970s, after the pandemic money printing bonanza. The financially sophisticated capital class knows how to use inflation to their advantage, and they are shielded by their hard assets. The rest of us asset poors, unfortunately, just seem to become poorer. Overall, this metric has fallen 31% since 1974. Returning to Turchin's rubric, we can safely say that popular immiseration is currently underway. Next on his list is elite overproduction, the factor that Turchin lists as the most significant driver of societal disintegration. Before we dive into that, we can quickly examine item number 3 and number 4, for these are easy to understand and also very obviously operative. For the U.S., we can note record high debt, decades of foolish but highly lucrative wealth extraction policies, and rapidly declining faith in government or the system more broadly as evidence for condition 3. For condition number 4, geopolitical factors, that's also easy. Once the media begins regularly discussing World War III, the realities of a new multipolar world, and a full-on attritional war on the European continent, it's safe to say the geopolitical factors aren't looking great either. But Turchin does point out that large, wealthy nations or empires like the U.S. are big enough such that geopolitical factors play less of a role. Empires, it turns out, are not likely to be destroyed by foreign powers, but rather they are corroded from within by a ruling class that spirals further and further into corruption, greed, decadence, and immorality. Maybe they descend from a noble lineage that built the system, but they lack the skills or interest to maintain it. Eventually, the wealth that accrues within an empire becomes too tempting for the ruling elites. Why conserve and maintain when you can merely extract and pilfer? Notions of legacy, a brighter future, and noblesse oblige fade, replaced instead with visions of yachts, mansions, and the temptations that exist on private tropical islands. Next, we'll dive into the concept of elite overproduction. It is a very powerful idea, and once you wrap your head around it, it may change how you see the world forever. A precondition necessary for elite overproduction to tip a society into the disintegration phase is a general shrinking of the pie and a reduced availability of resources and opportunities. As such, it is downstream from the wealth pump and popular immiseration. In any society, there's always a drive for social mobility. However, when times get tougher and resources more scarce, the drive turns into a strong driving force. Gotta get yours while you still can. People have a sixth sense for growing scarcity. It's how we've survived this long. Turchin also discusses the role of the state in times of scarcity. During the medieval crisis in France and during a period of elite overproduction, nobles desperate to maintain their status sought employment with the state. The state, of course, has the power to create laws and taxation regimes that extract what little money remains from the underclass. In modern America, we too see this phenomenon. As private sector employment becomes less lucrative and more precarious, more people clamor to enter the ranks of the state bureaucracy. Get inside the beast, make new laws, new regulations, and tax the productive sectors of the society to maintain your meal ticket. If we look at notoriously big government California, lovers of regulation and taxation, we can see that employment in the California state government has increased 1.5 times since 1990. And shockingly, the average California state government worker makes over 2 times more than the average California private sector worker. And keep in mind, there are many very, very well-paid private sector tech workers in California that drive this private sector average up. For the standard issue rank and file in the private sector, things are much worse. For U.S. federal government employees, they make 1.6 times more than the average private sector worker. So much for the myth of the noble, self-sacrificing public servant. State and federal government jobs also come with very cushy benefits. Lots of vacation, lucrative pension plans, and state employees are often virtually unfireable. Compare that with the precarity of the modern private sector, where your factory could be shut down or layoffs announced, regardless of how you perform on the job. Good luck making those 30 years worth of payments on your mortgage without a stable government job nowadays. But how do you get these cushy government jobs? Well, you'll probably need a degree, and that brings us to the heart of the elite overproduction crisis in America. In this video, we'll focus on America, but many of these things are true in Europe as well. Stories of students getting a bachelor's degree, failing to find a job, getting a master's degree, or maybe even a second master's degree, and working countless unpaid internships for the mere chance to enter the ranks of the state bureaucracy are well known there as well. Our modern societies are still much more upwardly mobile when compared with the old aristocratic societies of old. The best way, so we're told, to achieve upward mobility is to get a university degree. But of course, what happens when the university system starts producing more graduates than the employment system can absorb? Well, that would be elite overproduction. To use an example from Turchin, we can use a simplified scenario to demonstrate how this quickly gets out of hand. Let's say that in year 1, the university system produces 20 new graduates, or we will refer to them as aspirant elites, as they are seeking to enter the elite, or to at least level themselves up socioeconomically. Elite aspirants don't necessarily have to be trying to crack into the top 1%, but instead they are seeking to move up. Perhaps a middle-class person seeks to enter the top 10%, or an existing 10%er wants to crack into the top 1%. In any case, they certainly don't want to end up worse than their parents, especially after taking on what may be tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. But if the university degree mill is cranking at a higher rate than the employment sector can absorb, then we arrive at a problem. In our example, we have 20 elite aspirants and only 10 available chairs. Thus, 10 graduates enter onto the conveyor belt of upward mobility, and the other 10 are left behind as frustrated elite aspirants. Now, in the next year, we have a new crop of 20 graduates, along with the old, on-the-shelf, stale graduates from the year before. But there are still only 10 chairs available. In our simplified example, we will assume that the number of elite chairs stays relatively constant due to its growth being significantly slower than the rate of graduate overproduction. When we seat the new graduates in year 2, there are now 20 frustrated elite aspirants. By year 3, there are 30. By year 4, there are 40. By year 10, there are 100. And by year 20, there are 200. Now, this is a small-scale example, and the true scale of this problem is much larger. These people also have taken on large amounts of debt in pursuit of this empty promise. Not to mention, many of them may have majored in economically dubious, ideologically driven education programs while being exposed to neo-Marxist, anti-capitalist, and anti-Western ideologies. In other words, the institution of higher education, fueled by the mother of all institutions, the federal government, who dispensed the ill-advised loans to people hardly old enough to sign legal paperwork, may have raised itself an army of angry, revolutionary, anti-Western, and anti-capitalist troops that want to overthrow the existing elite regime. In Turchin's framework, these are the frustrated counter-elites who will do battle with the existing elite ruling class. Although in my opinion, they were not only funded and trained by the establishment, but they also blindly support many of the policies that benefit elite capital: open borders, divisive identity politics, and deindustrialization primarily. These anti-Western, anti-capitalist counter-elites, quite unsurprisingly, want socialism, wealth redistribution, or even communism. They can be found on the streets protesting against the flavor of the week topic that comes down from on high, and, as it is sometimes alleged, as part of pay-to-protest rent-a-mobs. But politics and political financing is murky business. Now, at first glance, this may seem strange. Why would the American ruling class, those populated by hyper-wealthy capitalists and their managerial class subordinates, seek to build a frustrated army of vehement anti-capitalists? Well, that is a complex question indeed, and perhaps I'll dedicate a future video to addressing that question in particular. But I have made several videos detailing what appears to be the final wealth extraction cycle and the benefits of dividing the masses in the old tried and true divide and conquer strategy. We can also point out that these anti-Western anti-capitalists have many things in common with the hyper-elite capitalist class. For one, they both support open border policies that depress wages and enrich the elite, what Bernie Sanders formerly referred to as a Koch brothers proposal, but oh, have the times changed. Further, they also love the climate narrative, the very ideology that was used to justify the outsourcing and deindustrialization that made the hyper-elites even wealthier. It's also interesting to note that the divisive instrument of identity politics rose rapidly to prominence in the wake of Occupy Wall Street. When the Holy Cathedral itself was threatened, suddenly a new ultra-divisive ideology emerged to split the masses. Fancy that. People on the left also tend to advocate for an ever-expanding government. You know, the government apparatus that the hyper-wealthy elite control via lobbying and special interest groups and use to redirect vast flows of taxpayer dollars to their coffers. This also appeals to the bureaucrats and managerial class. More rules, more regulations, more barriers to entry, more bureaucratic expansion, and bigger budgets. Tricky, like a judo flip, the skilled elite masters know how to redirect the energy and inertia of their opponent. Maybe it's not so confusing after all. Next, we'll dive into the numbers of elite overproduction, as well as the crippling debt burden that has been placed on the youth of America. What better way to create a dependent client class, one who hangs all their hopes on the empty promises of a politician to erase their debt, than to indebt them in the first place? To begin with, we'll take a look at the Gini index, a measure of income inequality. If we propose that the wealth pump and elite overproduction will work in tandem, first we need to identify when the wealth pump switched on. Through the 1960s and 70s, income inequality was actually decreasing, a good thing for regular people. However, there's a very strong and noticeable inflection point around 1980. A quick note here as well, the Gini index is income inequality and not wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is actually much worse. Regular people generally acquire their wealth through their incomes. They make a salary, save a portion of it, or invest a portion of it in assets in order to generate wealth. The already wealthy, in contrast, often don't have incomes or salaries per se. Instead, they rely upon generating returns on their existing capital via mechanisms like capital gains, interest, dividends, or rent. Generally, we can describe income as a flow of money, whereas wealth is like a capital stock. In order for regular people to get ahead and build wealth and a capital stock, they're highly reliant upon their incomes and salaries. Thus, their salaries and income represent a critical vulnerability and a vector for attack. As income inequality began to grow in the 1980s, the ability of the working and middle classes to generate wealth began to fall. In other words, the start of deindustrialization and proto-globalism in the 1970s and 80s began to erode the income sources of the American working and middle classes. Anyone who grew up in the American Rust Belt can attest to this. Depending on your age, you may even remember when some of these now shuttered and decaying factories and industrial zones provided income and economic lifeblood for their once vibrant communities. For those of us who are younger, we just remember them as already decaying relics, archaeological evidence of a time that we never knew. More abstractly, these looming hulks and their abandoned smokestacks, missing windows, and sun-bleached empty parking lots provided a more subtle psychological motivator. Go to university and get a degree because there's no future here. And that is just what people did. Here we show the percentage of the U.S. population with a bachelor's degree or higher from 1910 until the present. Just as we saw with the Gini index, we find a similar inflection point in between 1970 and 1980. This was to be a turning point for the U.S., a transition from building and manufacturing things to merely extracting wealth via elaborate financialization mechanisms and outsourcing. More people sought higher education in order to escape the growing economic destitution zones from which they came, pursuing the promise of the lucrative future service economy. If we do a linear regression, we can see that the rate at which people acquired higher education jumped almost fourfold in between these two periods. As the wealth pump turned on, the period of elite overproduction began. And as Turchin's extensive quantitative analyses of past historical disintegration show, so too began our society's disintegration. As with all things, this process at first seemed great. It's hard to argue against education, after all. However, in 2025, from our vantage point, we can see that the blind and aggressive pursuit of ostensibly good things can lead to folly, or in the case of education, it can be used as a clever mechanism for indoctrination, social division, and debt bondage. If the seed for America's decline was planted in the 1970s, the noxious weed began to sprout and grow rapidly after the turn of the millennium. A weed not unlike those you can find growing through the cracks in a now abandoned parking lot of a decaying Midwestern factory. Sometimes they even grow into full trees. If we turn to student loan debt, we arrive at this fun graph. From 2003 until 2020, student loan debt rose from $250 billion all the way past the $1.5 trillion mark. Its exceptionally linear growth only slowing post-2020 in the wake of the student loan interest pause and pandemic-era money printing. And just like that, a significant portion of a generation was sold off into debt bondage. In order to build wealth, buy a home, buy assets, you must first secure a good income. But in order to secure a good income, you must first indebt yourself. It seems they left out the part where indebting yourself isn't very conducive to wealth building. And, as we can see, a lot of people jumped aboard this train. The increasing number of bachelor's and master's degrees served to dilute out the premium that such education provided in the first place. Meanwhile, prices to get the degree skyrocketed, as did the debt burden. We can see that the number of people graduating with a bachelor's degree jumped 69% in between 2000 and 2023, while master's degrees jumped by 89%. Oversupply, inadequate demand, and the reduced educational standards that were needed to push an increasingly high number of people through America's once esteemed higher education system facilitated the very thing, elite overproduction, that Turchin identifies as the main driver of societal disintegration. But the institutions of higher education have interests of their own, as do all institutions. If one is to keep this pyramid scheme alive, one has to find employment for at least some of these surplus graduates. Here, we can see a feedback loop emerge. To some degree, the spiraling costs of higher education can be at least in part attributed to the expansion of the university administration and bureaucratic bloat. Despite many more people going to university, the ranks of the professors, the ones who, actually teach the students, has only risen by around 25%, whereas the number of administrators has risen by 67% since 2005. These new administrators and bureaucrats not only draw a nice salary, but they go about making themselves busy in the time-tested bureaucratic pursuit, expanding their ranks and expanding their budgets. A student who has taken on $50,000 plus in debt, pursuing a bachelor's degree in pottery or cultural studies, upon realizing that their career prospects are dismal, need only re-enroll in a master's program and attempt to get hired somewhere from within the vast and never-expanding ranks of the university bureaucracy. There, they can be shielded from the grim capitalist world outside, strangely self-assured that they are fighting the man and striving to end exploitation, as they themselves join the very apparatus that will exploit and indebt the next generation. A poignant example of the self-serving ideology into which they were indoctrinated. Just as baby boomers grew up fighting the man, only to eventually become the man, working from within the bowels of extractive corporate America, so too have many of these intrepid Marxists and postmodernists who now rule the institutions of higher education. But don't wake a sleepwalker, for they can be both unpredictable and dangerous. And it's difficult to get a person to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it, after all. We can also see this trend, the expansion in the ranks of administrators rather than teachers, in the lower rungs of the education system as well. From 2000 to 2019, the number of teachers increased by around 9%, whereas the number of well-paid district administrators increased by almost 90%. And I'm sure many of them are favorable towards neo-Marxism, holding a strong resentment for the West and capitalism, the very things that built the middle class in the first place. From within the beast, they toll, helping to seed the next generation with anti-Western, anti-capitalist ideas in the pursuit of cultivating ever more revolutionary troops, in their pursuit of expanding the bureaucracy and the mass state. But it seems we are nearing the end of this phase. Higher education to some degree has already peaked because of a combination of factors. One is the staggeringly high cost, knowledge of the diminishing returns, and awareness of the debt burden that comes with pursuing higher education. But there are also demographic factors. America has fewer young people, so the stock of naive youth that will sign their life away on the dotted line is declining. To the astute observer, however, one can realize that there is still hope to keep this pyramid scheme alive, open borders and mass migration. Maybe it's no accident that universities and university students are often at the vanguard of pro-illegal immigration protests. They are merely serving their institutional master and the ideology that has been placed into their heads. Let even more young people come into your country to further reduce what little economic value you possess, but at least you get to self-aggrandize and feel morally superior, ignorantly unaware that you're serving your capitalist masters. The Koch brothers' proposal that Bernie Sanders so accurately described before he conveniently forgot how to be accurate. And here we arrive at our current reality, all of Turchin's conditions seemingly met. Popular immiseration, elite overproduction, failing fiscal health, and a delegitimized state, with new geopolitical hotspots popping up every day. Societal disintegration is certainly underway, but what will come next is unknown. America in 2025 can almost be split into two camps. One camp remembers stories from their fathers or grandfathers when they worked at a local factory, had a house, a car, and a family. To some degree, it fundamentally is a grassroots movement, a populist movement, conjured up by the shared memories and the shared consciousness of a better time. They love their country, are patriotic, and want to preserve its way of life. Whether that way of life is real or merely a figment derived from their collective memories and mythology is irrelevant. They want to return to this hazy, nostalgic past, one that has been destroyed by deindustrialization, outsourcing, and globalization, one in which a social contract existed, money was spent at home rather than abroad, and the elite were capable of creating broad prosperity and opportunities. In our period of societal destabilization, they make up the conservative or right-wing revolutionary group. At the top of their ranks are the conservative counter-elites who wage war against the global liberal establishment and their open border policies that depress wages and their climate policies that shut down factories. At the top of the pyramid stands Donald Trump, a seemingly dark horse candidate who gained credibility as the American Uniparty and governmental apparatus waged open war upon him in his first presidential term. But in his second term, already, he appears to have been a mere mirage, floating above the shifting sands of declining and increasingly demoralized America. Perhaps a mere construction, a conjuring of the elite ruling classes as they go about finishing their job of looting, extracting, and inflating away the value of the US dollar. Simply a means to buy more time. The last of the middle-class wealth held within the aging boomer and silent populations is almost ripe for the harvesting, and the fact that Trump is so divisive and polarizing is simply a cherry on top. However, at the very least, for the right-wing populists, he at least says the right words. The only one in power that appears to resist the hegemonic force of globalized neoliberalism that completely dominates the American Democratic Party, the European Union, the UK, Canada, and Australia. When almost all hope has been lost, words carry weight, even in the absence of objective results, at least for a time. On the other side of the ideological battlefield, we find the left-wing credentialed class, revolutionaries, street anarchists, and their counter-elites. the ones bred from within the U.S. establishment itself and from within its institutions of higher learning. The revolutionary fervor funded by the American taxpayer, wealthy donors, and corporate grants. They aim for some kind of universalist, utopian, socialist future, one where the wealthy are taxed their fair share and the size of the state grows ever larger in order to facilitate wealth redistribution and vaguely defined goals of social justice. Their stated enemy is capitalism and even the West itself. Many will proudly and gleefully exclaim that they can't wait to see the West fall. We might as well take their word for it. They openly profess hatred of their country, its past, and seek to deconstruct and problematize the achievements of Western society more broadly. At the top of their pyramid, perhaps, tucked in a corner and out of sight, are establishment media outlets, international NGOs, the multinational corporate beneficiaries of globalism, academic experts, established political figures with left-wing Marxism in their blood, and the World Economic Forum policies that they so skillfully serve, all desperately trying to keep their dog on the leash and pointed only in the direction of the anti-establishment right-wing populists. On both sides of the line, both camps speak out against oligarchs, the elite, and corporate greed. But their explanation for these things and their proposed solutions differ. They have been divided and they have been conquered, categorized and sorted into separate algorithmically mediated realities by an apparatus that they cannot see or understand. What the outcome of this battle will be is uncertain, if there is to be a battle at all. But perhaps the United States of America and some of its Western allies abroad can at least repivot to economic and industrial realism and sustainability, real sustainability, and reclaim that word from the apparatus that has used it as a cover story and a buzzword for much of the deindustrialization and crippling dependence that has resulted from decades of globalization. In the modern mass state, escaping the iron rule of oligarchy is a near impossibility, just as the socialist dream of an egalitarian workers' paradise proved to be impossible after nearly a century of experimentation. But it will be different this time, they say. Forget the nearly 100 million people who were casualties of this experiment, exercised in the pursuit of ideological purity, starved, tortured, and imprisoned. Despite the stated goal of a ground-up movement, a nation run by the proletariat, the communists succeeded in building a monument to centrally controlled monolithic power, a mass state, and in that tower resided the communist elite ruling class, and from there, they, along with their secret police forces and informant networks, controlled the masses. Iron rule by a committee composed of a handful of elites, masquerading as a dictatorship of the proletariat. Because of the spiraling complexity of modern society, the rise of the mass state was foretold and accurately predicted by James Burnham in his 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution. Over the decades, step by step, we have all become more atomized and more dependent on this mass state, while its power slowly broadened and expanded to nearly every facet of our lives and every corner of the Western world. To some degree, for the managers, bureaucrats, and post-national hyper-elites that fund them, the ideological flag that they fly under is irrelevant. Just as it always has been, their game is power and control. The ends justify the means. Perhaps ideological conflicts are just a distraction, another means of divide, rule, and conquer. The more bizarre the ideology, the better. Quick changes in the direction of the narrative are relevant, as the recent past is continuously memory hold. Awareness only of the present moment's panic prevails, and the masses are kept disorganized and at odds with each other. With modern technology, AI, and algorithmic siloing, deciphering anything, the real from the mirage, too, is a near impossibility. As regular people, we don't understand history, our ability to organize is limited, and our attentions can be scattered easily to the wind. But our wishes and desires are relatively simple, coherent, and persistent throughout history. Safety, security, a good life today, and hopefully a slightly better life tomorrow. From somewhere atop the apparatus lies the ruling elite, the capital class, bureaucratic technocrats, vestiges of the aristocracy, and the hyper-wealthy. Perhaps they understand history better than us and have studied it more intently, for they have more resources and they have more to lose. Just like ours, their wishes and desires have been relatively simple, coherent, and persistent throughout history, to gain, hold, and maintain power and control over the bottom 90%. On the eve of what could be a technological singularity, they may have solved the game once and for all. Maybe the apparent decay of their system and the loss of our faith in it is merely a matter of timing. the illusion sustained only until it became unnecessary. The reluctant need for us, our blood, sweat, and labor, may be coming to a close. Technology, AI, robot workers, and robot dogs with AI-controlled machine guns may be coming to encircle us all. As Turchin's work shows, history has patterns and recurring themes, and although the future is not precisely predictable, it can be broadly ballpark predicted. But with the technological singularity no longer a thing of science fiction, it means that the future will likely be discontinuous with the past, although many of the same themes will hold. At the top, there will be a few, and at the bottom, many. But this time, there will exist a technology that has the capability of freezing the game, locking us into an unmoving stasis. Perhaps the dream held by all past generations of ruling elites come true, to make the status quo permanent, neutralize all rival factions, and finally sleep peacefully in their well-tended and well-guarded estates and castles in a state of eternal serenity. Anyway, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. Perhaps the best way to escape doomerism and maximize your chances of success in an increasingly scary world is to befriend the Amish. They've already error-proofed against societal destabilization. That's both a joke as well as probably good advice. Although, I don't know if they would have any defenses against AI robot machine gun dogs. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, or leaving me a comment. If you're new to the channel, check out some of my other videos where I do deep dives in economic data. Thanks again, and have a nice day or night.